All right, so let's continue our study of John. We're going to be in chapter 8 again, and we're going to start in verse 31 in a minute. So if you remember where we're at in our little map here, we're in the Feast of Tabernacles section. And like I told you last time, that begins in chapter 7. It goes all the way halfway into chapter 10. So we're going to be at this same feast for a while. Chapter 7, toward the end of chapter 7, it tells us that it was the last day of the feast. So all the way from that point into chapter 10, we're still on that one day of the feast where he's in the temple and he's arguing with people and teaching things and blowing people's minds and stuff. So we're still in that section. So where we're going to pick up tonight in a few minutes is a continuation of the same conversation we've been in for a couple weeks now. So we're kind of jumping in mid-conversation, but if you've been here, you're kind of already aware of where we've been. Now, he's going to do some interesting things in this discussion. He's already talked about who he is and he's connecting to different things that's happening at the festival, which they should have kind of clued into. But there's this back and forth constantly. Now, before we dive into what he's going to cover tonight, so the title of tonight's teaching is Who's Your Daddy? Because that's really the issue that Jesus is going to deal with these Jewish people. So in order to dig into that concept of who do you belong to, we need to see the biblical basis for this theme before we jump into this story, because that gives you the context that John wants you to have already in your head. Right? Because remember, John thinks his audience knows something about the Old Testament already, right? Because he's writing to people who evidently were in a Jewish context, at least in some way. So here's what I want to do. We're going to start in Genesis, and then we'll jump to John chapter 1 and pick up the theme there, and then go into chapter 8, all right? So I'm going to move fast tonight. We should have plenty of time, so I'll try not to move too fast, but try to get through this because there is a lot of verses here. Okay, Genesis chapter 3. This is the passage where the fall has already happened, right? Genesis 3 is the famous passage where humanity blows it, right? Or two members of humanity did. So at the end of that discussion, or the end of that event, God comes to them and has a conversation with them, right? Because God seeks sinners, yes? Yeah, he doesn't run from the sinners, he goes toward the sinners. And he has a conversation with them. And there's that whole blame game that Adam does, well, it's the woman you gave me, and then he turns to the woman, and well, it was the serpent, and she was partially correct. So there's that discussion, and then God tells them, well, this is the results of what you've just done, okay? Now, so we're just kind of jumping in on this one verse here. I don't have time to tell that whole story, but in this passage, God is talking to the serpent. Okay, so he's talking to the devil here. He says, I will put enmity or hostility, or you could even say war. I'm going to put war between you and the woman. And then what he means by that is between your offspring and her offspring. So it's like, okay, so I'm going to put a war between the serpent's offspring. So apparently there's little serpent babies, baby snakes, right? Not literally, it's a spiritual thing. And her offspring, talking about Eve. So now specifically this refers to Jesus, right? Because if you look in Hebrew, the word offspring here is singular, not plural. So it's not offsprings, it's one specific offspring. And he will bruise your head and you will bruise his heel. Or actually, he will crush your head and you'll bruise his heel, right? So in the beginning of the Bible, we're told there's this tension between two families. Are you the seed of the woman or the seed of the serpent? You see that? Okay, so that's the two families. There's the children or followers of Yahweh, or there's the children or followers of the serpent. And if you turn to Genesis chapter 4, you see the battle continue. Like you see a perfect example of that battle, Cain and Abel, right? Abel's the one who's trying to follow Yahweh and do the right thing. Cain becomes a murderer, okay? That's going to come up in tonight's study in John 8. Okay, so that theme begins in Genesis 3, and it goes throughout the entire Bible, all right? That it culminates in Christ, but it even continues after that. Are you going to be the seed of Christ, or are you going to be the seed of the serpent? That's the issue, right? Make sense? So that's where that begins. Who do you belong to? Which family do you belong to? John chapter 1, this is the prologue where John gives us all the themes that we need to have in our head. And like I told you way back 18 weeks ago, it's like he dumps a bunch of soccer balls out on a field, and each ball represents a theme, and he's just going to kick all of them down the field at the same time, and they're all going to end up in the empty tomb at the end. That's the goal, right? That's what all these themes are designed to do. So here's the theme that we're going to see tonight. He says, he, that's Jesus, the Word, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. Now, who is his own people? The Jewish people, the nation of Israel, right? He's talking about family here, right? Jesus came from Israel. He's an Israelite. That's his people. But they didn't receive him. But to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right or the authority, right, to become children of God, to become children of Yahweh, right, to be in his family. And the people who are children of God are born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or the will of man, but born of God. Okay, so he's making it clear up front. These are John's words. He's saying to be a child of God has nothing to do with your ethnicity, your family line, or what nation you're a part of. That's what he means by these terms, because he's writing to Jewish people who think it's all about blood, bloodlines, nationality, ethnicity. They're big on that stuff, and they think they're saved because of it. Okay, so he tells you out the gate in the prologue, this is going to be a big storyline in this gospel I'm writing, okay? In John 8 is where this gets really elevated. So what we're about to read is all tracking back to this. Are we born of God? And is born of God meaning something to do with your ethnicity or nationality, all right? That's the struggle we're going to be in tonight. Okay, ready for John 8? John chapter 8, verse 31. Here we go. I love this passage, by the way. This "Who's Your Daddy" passage is awesome. Okay? So Jesus said to the Jews who had believed him. Now, if you're reading an old-fashioned Bible, go one verse up in verse 30, and it'll say, and as he said these things, many believed in him. Right? Okay? So we're picking right up on that storyline. So there's some Jewish people who've been arguing with him, but some of them, many of them, are starting to believe what he's saying. So he's going to talk directly to the people who are starting to believe. Make sense? Okay, that's important because in a few minutes it's going to sound like they don't believe. So then it creates this tension. So he said to the Jews who had believed him, if you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples. Did you know? Okay, so is this an unconditional statement or a conditional statement? It starts with if. By definition, that's a conditional statement. So he says, if you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples. So he's talking to people who are starting to believe what he is saying. Notice it didn't say the Jews who had believed in him. It just said the Jews who had believed him. Meaning they heard what he said and they're going, maybe that's true. But they're not believing in him yet. That's a very important distinction in the Gospels. There's believing him, like I believe what he said. And then there's believing in him, which means I'm now putting my life in his hands. See that distinction? So he says, now, if you're starting to believe me, just know this. You're only truly my disciples if you abide in my word. Now that abiding word is going to come up again in John's Gospel. Abide in me and I will abide in you and that whole thing. It's a big deal in John 15. So he's introducing it here. If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples. And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, let me ask you something because you've read John 14 before. At least you've heard it quoted many times. Is the truth a thing or a person? Yeah, person. I am the way, the truth, and the life, right? The truth and the word is a person. His name is Yeshua, Jesus, right? So to abide in my word means to abide in me, right? So he's saying you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Now, this is so important both in that culture and in this culture. Because here's what we do with truth today, okay? Our culture is trying to say that what we call truth is enslaving people. It's telling them they can't do things they want to do. So truth has been made out in our relativistic culture nowadays. It's like a bad word now. I was watching a documentary a while back. It's the one called "What Is a Woman?" You should watch that. If you haven't seen it, you should watch it so you can be aware of what's going on in your culture and where you're sending your kids when you send them to universities. Okay, this guy interviews a university professor, and they have this conversation, and it goes all over the place. This guy's like a social, sociology type guy, and he's a college professor. And when the interviewer brought up the word truth, you can watch the entire person change in this man. He goes from having a conversation, and he's kind of agitated because he knows the interviewer disagrees with him. And then when he gets to, he says, "Why do you care about this issue so much?" And the interviewer says, "Well, because I care about the truth. And you're a university, you're supposed to be focusing on what is true. And you're kind of saying there isn't truth, you know?" And you can watch this college professor immediately turn into somebody else. He got so angry and was he got flustered. He couldn't sit still. He did not want to talk about truth. And he actually kind of demonized the interviewer for even bringing up the word truth. So, right, that's what is going on in universities near you. Okay? So, when we talk about truth, the world hears bondage. Jesus comes on the scene and goes, "No, it's actually the truth that sets you free from the bondage you're already in." Right? So when he made this statement, this is a beautiful statement. You will know the truth, and it's the truth that will set you free from your own confusion. Yes? That's good, right? Great scripture. Listen to how they respond, though. They answered him, "We are offspring of Abraham, and we have never been enslaved to anyone. How is it that you say you will become free?" Does that seem like a weird response? You shall know the truth, and the truth will set you free. He's calling us slaves. That's their response. You're saying that what do you mean that I can be set free? I don't need to be set free. That's their response. And what's their reason for thinking they're not slaves? We're descendants of Abraham. Now, this is about the dumbest thing Israelites could say. If you know the Bible at all, if you've ever read Exodus, right? Who's enslaved in Egypt? Israel is enslaved in Egypt, not just for a minute, for 430 years. It's like a big section of their history that they were slaves. Their entire salvation theology, everything they thought about salvation, it comes from the Exodus story, when they were slaves. We're children of Abraham. We're Israelites. We've never been enslaved to anyone. Let me just give you a list, okay? I wish I'd have been standing there, which was probably good. I'd have messed it all up. But they'd been slaves in Egypt, okay? And then later on, Israel splits into two kingdoms, but they're still the descendants of Abraham. You had the northern kingdom and southern kingdom. Northern kingdom was taken captive by Assyria, and some of them were enslaved by them, so others were sent out to other nations, but still were under bondage of that nation. So you got Egypt, Assyria. The southern kingdom gets exiled to Babylon, right? And then after Babylon, it was Persia and Greece. And then these people who said this are under Roman rule at that time. So when you read that, it's like, boy, these people are really deceived about who they are and where they're at in life, right? We've never been enslaved to anyone. Rome, like right now, not to mention Greece and Persia and Babylon and Assyria and Egypt, right? And Satan, right? That's the thing they don't realize that he's going to bring up. They're slaves and they don't know it. But it's not about Rome. It's about sin and Satan. That's who they're really slaves to. But I just thought that was hilarious. We've never been enslaved to anyone. It's like, what? You're Israelites, right? Now remember, part of the reason they might have reacted this way is they might have had slavery on their mind because they are celebrating the Feast of Tabernacles, which is a celebration of the years right after they got out of Egypt and they were in the wilderness, right? Living in tents. That's why it's called the Feast of Tabernacles, tent, right? So that might be why they're bringing this up, but it really seems like they have a very skewed view of their history, right? Now, he goes on to say this. Jesus answered them, because, they're not slaves to anyone. Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. Sounds like bad news, doesn't it? It is bad news. But here's what he's saying. He's not saying everyone who sins once in a while. He's saying everyone, the word practices here is in present tense active voice in Greek. It means it's somebody who's continuing with no intention to stop. Everyone who is living in sin is a slave to sin. Why are you living in it? Because you're enslaved by it, right? So if you went to, when Israel was enslaved in Egypt, and you went to an Israelite there and you said, why are you living in Egypt? Their answer would be, well, that's a dumb question. We're enslaved here. We can't leave. Well, it's the same issue going on here. Why are you living in sin? Well, apparently I'm enslaved to my sin and I'm not willing to be set free. Right? So he's telling them, you are slaves. Not just way back, in the Old Testament. You're slaves right now. But not to who you think. And he says, the slave does not remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. And by the way, we just read the word abide. Abide in my word. The Greek word there is meno. That's the same word for remain. So if you're reading this in Greek, it would look like the same exact word. So the slave does not abide in the house forever. The son remains forever. Now, let me explain what this means. In this context, this ancient context, slaves, especially in Israel, were not allowed to stay in the same household forever unless the slave chose to stay in that household. Because they had this thing in the Torah called the Jubilee, the year of Jubilee, right? You probably sang a song with that phrase in it and had no idea what you were singing about, right? The year of Jubilee is when all debts were forgiven, all properties were returned to its original owner, and all slaves were set free. Every 49 years in Israel, they were commanded by God to do that. No slave remains in the house forever. They're to be set free at the year of Jubilee. There's no evidence in all of history that Israel ever followed that command. That's interesting. One of the greatest things their culture was given by God was freedom from debt, from loss, and from slavery every 49 years, and they never did it. Interesting. So he brings that up here. He says, the slave's not supposed to remain in the house forever. The son remains forever. Because here's the deal. You can set a slave free, and they are no longer part of your household. But you could even kick your son out of the house. They're still your son. Right? Right? So he's speaking into a cultural situation here, a cultural dynamic that they understood. We have to kind of dig around to figure it out. But he's saying, if you're a slave, you don't remain in the household forever. But if you're part of the family, you remain forever. That's good news. Right? We're not just servants of Christ. We're family members of Christ. That's a big deal, right? Then he says this, so if the Son sets you free, you will be free indeed. And if you read that in Greek, it's if the Son sets you free, you will be dadgum free. Right? What he's saying here is if he sets you free, you are for sure free. Right? Remember, he's talking about being a slave to sin here. So if Jesus sets us free, we've been liberated. Right? But you have to come to Jesus and you have to abide with him if you want to continue to be free. When you walk away from him, you get re-enslaved to sin. You have to come back to him to be set free from that again, right? Now, I'm not talking about losing your salvation and getting re-saved multiple times. That's not what I'm saying right now. I'm saying anytime you walk away from the liberator and go back to the enslaver, you're going to be enslaved by your sin again, right? So what he's saying here is, look, if you would just stay with me, you'll be free. If you're starting to believe in me, which is what these people were doing, you have to stay with me, or you're going to keep being enslaved by sin. Then he says this, oh yeah, that thing about, offspring of Abraham, I know all that. I know that you're an offspring of Abraham, yet you seek to kill me, because my word finds no place in you. You could also translate that, my word has no room to abide in you. In your heart, you don't have enough room for me. Right? You've got all your Pharisaic traditions and all of the Talmudic added things that you did. That was a big word, wasn't it? Talmudic. That's a Jewish set of traditions. You've got all this stuff stuffed in your heart, and you care about what everybody else thinks about you, and you're wealthy, and you want to hang on to that. All that's in your heart. You don't have a place for me in there, right? But you keep thinking that because you are an Israelite, you're good. Now, let me speak into this for a minute, because we really need to understand how the Jewish people thought at that time, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about this, okay? These people Jesus is talking to, they do not think, they don't believe in works-based salvation. We've often thought that's how they thought, because they were so legalistic. That's not how they thought about salvation. They believe they would be saved simply because they're Israelites. I can take you and show you their writings, okay? They literally thought, even after they died, they believed that Abraham was going to rescue them from Hades or Gehenna, the lake of fire, that he would rescue them and keep them from that because they're Israelites. They're his descendants, and Abraham's going to rescue us. So in their minds, Abraham is more of a Messiah than Jesus is. Make sense? Okay? So they really did think, we're elect. We're the chosen people of God. We're already saved. So what are you talking about, Jesus, that we need to be saved and set free? That's why they're so confused right now. He says, look, I know that's what you think about you. But you're trying to kill me right now. Right? You guys have been trying to kill me the last 3 chapters. Right? Because my word has no place in you. He says, I speak of what I've seen with my Father, and you do what you have heard from your father. Now, who do they think is their father? Abraham. Father Abraham had many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. I love doing that to you, because you're not going to be able to stop singing that song for the rest of the night. You're welcome, right? When he says this line, they're thinking Abraham, right? We're offspring of Abraham. That's our father. They answered him, Abraham is our father, right? Jesus said to them, if you were Abraham's children, you would be doing the works Abraham did. Now let's just pause right here, and let's think about what Abraham did, okay? Here's one thing that we know. I'll put it in the form of a question. Did Abraham believe God when God came to him and said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you? So he believed God, right? Was that all Abraham did? No, because what was part of believing what God said? He said, I'm going to make a great nation out of you. But before he said that, he said, get your stuff and get out of Babylon or the land of Ur, right? Get out of there and go to the place I will show you. I will make a great nation out of you. So it was, he believed God and he did what God said, right? We talked about this in our Buzzwords series, part 1. We talked about faith, right? Okay, so 2 things for sure Abraham did. He believed God, he believed what he said, and he did it. And he was not perfect, but he did it. He left town, he went towards the promised land, right? And he had all kinds of failures, but ultimately he stayed faithful to Yahweh and did what he said, right? So he says, look, if you were Abraham's kids, you'd be doing things that Abraham does. You wouldn't just say you believe me and then you want to kill me. That doesn't add up, right? But Abraham believed and did. He did to do the works Abraham did. But now you seek to kill me, a man who has told the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. Abraham did not go around killing people who were speaking for God, right? He says, you are doing the works of your father that your father did. Wait a minute. But we told you our father was Abraham. Clearly, Jesus thinks they have a different daddy. They said to him, we were not born of sexual immorality, which is probably a reference to the Ishmael story, right? Y'all know about Ishmael, right? Ishmael was actually Abraham's firstborn son, but it was illegitimate because it was with Hagar, the servant girl, right? The Egyptian servant girl. So he's probably referring to that story. There's some other ideas too that I don't want to get into tonight, but so they're basically saying we're not illegitimate children. We have one father, even God. Oh, so now God's your father. Now it doesn't get brought up here, but just think about the first time they were trying to kill him in chapter 5. It was because he was claiming that God was his father. That was chapter 5. Now they're doing the same thing they want to kill him for. Well, okay, that Abraham thing didn't work, guys. All right, God's our dad. Let's try that one. Jesus said, if God were your father, you would love me. Because if God was your father and God's my father, then that would make us brothers and we'd love each other. For I came from God and I am here. I love that. As if they don't know he's here. There he is. I came not of my own accord, but he sent me. And why are you guys so dumb? Why do you not understand what I say? Here's why. It's because you cannot bear to hear my word. Now let's just pause there for a minute. When you're trying to talk to someone who disagrees with the Bible or disagrees with what you think the Bible says and means, just keep in mind that some people may not be able to understand the truth because of who their father is. And no amount of arguing is going to change their mind. So be gracious and patient when you're talking with an unbeliever or maybe a believer who's very misguided on something. Just keep in mind that maybe they're a believer in their head, but not in their heart. Maybe they're kind of like these Jewish believers, because remember at the very beginning he said he's talking to the Jews who said they believed him, right? He says, you can't bear my word. That's why you're having trouble understanding what I'm saying. Remember, you don't have a place in your heart for my word. And here's why. Your daddy is the devil. Imagine how that would go over. Try that at the next family Thanksgiving meal. Right? When somebody's ranting and raving and they're way wrong about something, just go, you know what? I figured it out. Your dad's the devil. That's why you're so messed up. Just try that, report back. Tell me how it goes. So he tells the leaders of the religion of the nation of Israel, you're working for the devil. And worse than that, he's your daddy. And your will is to do your father's desires. You know, he was a murderer from the beginning. And he does not stand in the truth because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character. Some translations translate this: when he lies, he speaks his native language. How about that? And I think that might actually be an accurate translation. For he is a liar and the father of lies. Here's what Jesus is claiming. And we're going to come back, break this down a little bit. But let's just camp on that last one for a second. Jesus is claiming that the devil invented lying. Where else would it come from? God didn't create lying, did he? No, because God does not sin, nor does he tempt anybody with sin. There's no evil in him at all, right? So let's go back to Genesis for a minute. We won't turn there, but let's just think about it. Remember in the garden, before the sin happens, right? How does the serpent get the humans to essentially kill themselves? He lies to them. And he's real clever, because Genesis 3, by the way, begins with, now the serpent was more clever, crafty than any other creature, right? So what he does, because he can't just come out, he couldn't just go up to Adam and Eve and go, hey, what God say about that whole fruit thing? What's that about? If she'd have said, well, he said, don't eat, we can have all the stuff we want, just not from that one tree. If he'd have said, oh yeah, you eat that and you will die for sure, but you really should eat it, would that have worked? No, what he had to do is he had to lie to him. He had to say, no, you won't surely die. No, God's just keeping hidden knowledge from you. He doesn't want you to be like him, right? So he had to lie to him so he could kill him, right? Because how does that story end? They get exiled from the tree of life, which means they're going to die. They start dying when they get away from the tree of life. So he's going all the way back to the beginning here, and he's saying, look, you're following the serpent. You're snake babies. And it's not a physical, ethnic issue, a bloodline issue. It's because of who you're following. Who you follow determines who you belong to. You're following the serpent, so you're the seed of the serpent. You're in that family. But I want you to be in the family of God. That's what Jesus is after. He's a murderer from the beginning. I mean, turn the page from Genesis 3 to chapter 4. What's the first thing he gets the next human to do? To kill his brother, Cain and Abel, right? And it just spirals from there. And there's no truth in him, because all he wants to do is lie. Why does he want to do that? You ever wondered that? Why does Satan want to be against God? Well, the most ancient writings, most evidence we have for the answer to that question is this. He was jealous that God put humans in charge of the earth. Let us make man in our image and let them have dominion over the earth. And all of the ancient writings, even outside of the Bible, in the Intertestament period, even some of the early church fathers after the New Testament, all say the same thing, that Satan was so jealous that he wasn't put in charge, that he decided, I'm going to kill these humans. He can't do it himself, so what does he have to do? Deceive us into killing ourselves. And he's been doing that since Genesis chapter 3. He can't kill you. He didn't have that kind of authority. He can convince you to do it. And listen, trust me, okay? He wants you dead. And if you let him get in your head long enough, he will try to convince you that maybe you should do it to yourself. Just end it, you'd be happier. I've heard him say that to me. So, aren't you glad you came for this encouraging message, right? But remember, we can be set free from him. Right? Amen? This is good news, right? What time is it? 7:04. I got to hurry. Okay. But because I tell you the truth, you do not believe me. Which one of you convicts me of sin? That's an important question that he's going to ask again at his own trial when they're trying to execute him. He's going to say, what sin did I commit? Right? Which one of you convicts me of sin? If I tell the truth, why do you not believe me? Whoever is of God, you might as well read here, whoever is born of God, hears the words of God. Right? The reason why you do not hear them is that you are not born of God. Now, is born of God a theme we've already seen? The conversation with Nicodemus, you must be born from above. It usually reads born again, not the best translation. It means born from above, right? Born of God. So just remember this. If people are not believing the gospel, it's a spiritual issue more than it's an intellectual issue. Okay, I'm all about having a solid defense for our faith, being able to explain our faith to people, being able to take apart arguments against our faith. I'm all for that. I've studied it. I continue to study it. I love that stuff. But just know this, until God grabs their heart and starts pulling in his direction, your arguments aren't going to make much good. Your arguments aren't going to save them. They might help them consider salvation, but you can't save anybody. I hate to break it to you. And actually that should make you happy, because it means people's salvation is not in your hands. However, you can mess it up for people, and you are accountable for that. So just keep that in mind. Whoever is born of God or of God hears the words of God. The reason these guys don't is because they're not of God. They're the devil is their daddy, right? The Jews answered him. Now look how they respond. Are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Do you see what just happened? He just said a bunch of things they don't like. At the beginning of this conversation, they were kind of starting to listen, right? But then he said, well, let's see how serious you are. And he gave them a bunch of stuff they don't want to hear. And how do they respond to truth? Well, that's racism. In that culture, this is a racist slur against Jesus, because the Jews hate Samaritans. The Jews believe the Samaritans, because they are not full-blooded Jews, that God has cursed them and wants nothing to do with them. Matter of fact, the Jews at this time believed that's how God thinks about everybody that's not them. If you're not full-blooded Israelite, you're not the chosen people of God, and to hell you go. Have a nice time. Right? And Jesus comes on the scene, and very early in John's gospel, he sits down at a well with a Samaritan woman who'd been married multiple times, to make the point, the gospel's for everybody. Right? I don't care who your daddy is. Right? So here's what they're doing. They've heard truth they don't like. They don't have an argument against it. So what do they resort to? Character assassination. Does that sound familiar to what goes on today? Just know this. If you're talking to somebody who's on the other end of the spectrum from Christianity about some issue, and you say something that is literally and logically true, you will likely get this reaction. Because here's what happens. When people know they don't have a logical argument for what they say they believe, they immediately start attacking you. And this is what happens all the time. I watch it all the time. I probably shouldn't watch this stuff as much as I do, but I like to hear where the culture's at. And here's where the culture's at. If we don't like what you say, we'll cancel you. We'll call you derogatory terms. This is what's going on here. You're a Samaritan and you're demon-possessed. And now that we've made that claim, you're canceled. That's what they're doing, trying to cancel Jesus. Like, literally, they want to kill him. Jesus answered, I do not have a demon. I honor my Father, and you dishonor me. Yet I do not seek my own glory. There is one who seeks it, and he is the judge. Here's what he's saying. I don't need glory from you guys. The Father has set his seal on me. The Father has said that I'm his beloved Son and he's well pleased in me. I don't need your glory. God's going to glorify me. Okay? So this is really not a debate about who's going to get the glory. Jesus has already got that, right? Truly, truly, I say to you, if, that's a conditional statement, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Now, Jesus is talking about eternal life here, right? Does he mean they'll never physically die? No, but that's what they think he means. The Jews said to him, now we know you have a demon. Because Father Abraham, who had many sons had Father Abraham, died. He dead. He gone, right? And the prophets are dead too. And they didn't want to bring up that, our ancestors killed all those prophets, but, that'd be a convenient detail not to mention. Abraham died, as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who's dead? And the prophets died. Who do you make yourself out to be? Now, the previous conversation we talked about last week, the same thing happened. Now, who are you really? And he goes, I've already told you this, and you just don't believe me. And here we are again. Who do you think you are? Right? Literally, who do you think you are? And here's why. Father Abraham died, and the prophets died. And come to think of it, everybody from Adam on died, except for that Enoch guy and maybe Moses, right? But everybody died. Who do you think you are thinking you can somehow get someone to bypass dying? That's what they're getting at, right? What do you mean? That if someone keeps your word, they won't die like everybody else does? What makes you so special? Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. It's like a loop conversation here. It's my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God. But you have not known him, you leaders of the whole religion of Israel, whose daddy is the devil, and you don't know God. I know him. If I were to say to you that I don't know him, I would be a liar just like you. But I do know him, and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. That seem weird to you at all? Think about what he just said. I was around when Abraham was. And Abraham saw me and was glad about it. What? So the Jews said, you're not even 50 years old. How have you seen Abraham? Right? Like you're like 30-ish. What do you mean? Abraham saw you. Well, remember, I've taught on this before, but remember if you go back in Genesis, every time, not every time, but most of the time that God shows up to talk to Abraham, he's in human form. If you go back and read those stories and pay attention, you'll see this. Matter of fact, if you read the Greek version of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it actually words it in a way that makes it more obvious, because that's how they were interpreting the Hebrew. So you'll see things like, the word of the Lord appeared to Abraham. How does a sound appear? The word of the Lord appeared to Abraham. It's because when you read the word came to Abraham, you should be thinking a person, not a sound, not just words. A person came. A messenger came. That story where Abraham has a meeting with 3 men, and he immediately knows these are not just men. And you're told in the story that one of those 3 men is Yahweh in the flesh. It's Yahweh in human form. So that's why Jesus could say, Abraham's met me before. And he was happy about it. The guy you think is your daddy kind of likes me. Right? That's what he's saying here. Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus cryptoed himself. That's what the Greek word is, crypto, and went out of the temple. I told you before, there's a literary frame going on here. Chapter 7, verse 4 uses the word crypto. Jesus is being secretive, right? And he goes to the feast, but he's being secretive. And then he's out in the open publicly, and now he's hiding again. That's like a literary frame where John says this all should be read together, right? But the bigger claim here is, before Abraham was, I am. Now, if anybody ever tells you, because you will find this in some people have been told this, that Jesus never actually claimed to be God, then why do they want to stone him? I've actually heard people say this that are against Christianity. They say, in the New Testament, Jesus never claimed to be God. Just read the Gospel of John. He does it all over the place, right? He actually uses God's name, Yahweh, I am, right? I was here before Abraham was. And they go, we know what you mean by that. It's time to die. Because you just claimed to be God in the flesh who appeared to Abraham in the Old Testament. You got to go. That's blasphemy in their mind, right? So he hid himself and he took off. And that's how that story ends. But it's actually not the end of the story because chapter 9 begins with the continuation of the story. Okay? All right, so here's the conclusion, and we got to pray and go. Those who believe and abide in the word are true disciples of Jesus. Notice the two elements there. Believe and abide. Believe and stay faithful, right? It doesn't mean they're perfect. It means they're staying faithful to Jesus. They're not walking away from Jesus. When we fail, we take it to Jesus, right? That's what we do. That means you are a follower of Jesus, right? Now, in our modern culture, we've taught people unintentionally that as long as you say you believe this and say this prayer, swim in a church hot tub, right? As long as you do that and you say you believe it, you're good because you're not saved by works. Okay, here's the problem. Jesus is talking to people who were believing him, and he's telling them their daddy's the devil. So apparently you can say you believe this, but your daddy can still be the devil. It's the abiding part that matters. Because the abiding is what proves that you actually believe. Make sense? It's the works that prove the faith. Go read James chapter 2. He's going to explain this. James chapter 2. And he actually brings up the Abraham story. And he says, Abraham didn't just believe what God said. He got up and did what God said. Right? And that was what led to him being declared righteous. Because he had true belief. Okay. Only the truth can set us free from the slavery of sin. If I had time, I could do a whole sermonette. I've never done a sermonette, but anyway. They told me I had 20 minutes to live the life yesterday when I spoke, and I was nervous the whole time because I knew there's no way I'm going to do this in 20 minutes, and it was 28, I think, because someone timed me. But anyway, only the truth can set us free from the slavery of sin. This is what we have to get better at as the American church. We have to realize that it's the truth that will set us free. The truth is not bondage. The truth is salvation. The truth is what breaks us out of the bondage we love to get ourselves into. I mean, if you think about it this way, left to our own devices, we would wake up every day and put chains back on. Because somehow we're comfortable in the chains. Jesus comes along and says, no, if you will follow the truth, the truth, I will set you free. So here's the deal, church. We're going to stand with the truth. Come hell or high water. We're going to stand with the truth and let the cards fall where they fall. That's what the early church did, and they went to their death for it. We can handle whatever minor persecution that we might have to face in this country. But we have to stand with the truth because it's only the truth that sets people free. So that means rejecting, changing, or compromising the Word of God is satanic. Isn't that what Jesus just told these people? These baby snakes, right? He said, if you don't believe what I'm saying right now because you got the wrong daddy, right? So any attempt in the modern church to either reject what God says or to change what God says or to say we're going to compromise on this a little bit. Where's that come from? Well, that doesn't come from God, and I think the only other option is it's satanic. It's Satan working his way in. And we're seeing this all over the place in our nation right now in the church. We're starting to reject in some areas, some whole denominations flat out rejecting what God has said. Some are changing and saying, no, those words don't mean what we think they mean. They actually mean this over here. Despite all of the language scholars saying, no, it means what it says, right? And then there's another category where we're starting to compromise on certain issues because we don't want the conflict that will come because of it. And listen, that's the easiest one to get into. All of us in this room are going to be tempted to compromise the truth to avoid conflict. But compromising also comes from the evil one. We have to be willing to stand with Jesus. Amen? And if we stand with him, we're free. If you don't, you're back in the chains. Right? All right, next week we're going to cover John chapter 9. So please read John chapter 9. You're wondering which verses? All of them. Right? I don't know how many verses it is. 41 verses. But it's a story. There's not a lot of deep teaching here. He's going to heal a blind man, and it's an interesting story, a debate between the Jewish people about how this happened and why and all that stuff. So it's a fun passage. So you'll enjoy reading this whole chapter. Okay? So you got a whole week to do it. Read chapter 9, and then we'll come back and enjoy the Gospel of John a little bit more.